Hello, I'm Susan Guthrie, America's Divorce Innovation Specialist and the creator of Divorce in a Better Way. And I'm here to give you some tips and insights into how to move through a divorce in a better way so that you can end up in a better place on the other side. Because having done this for 30 years, I know it is possible. And I'd like to see you get there. So I started a series. Somebody sent me a bunch of SEO searches for the top questions people are searching for when they go online and they're getting divorced. So I've been sort of trying to give some insights into those questions. And today's question is, and this one really is common. I've heard this in my 30 years, probably from every client who's walked through the door. What am I entitled to in a divorce? Everyone becomes very concerned for very good reason, right? There's so much uncertainty when you go into the divorce process about where you're going to end up after the process, after you go through this. And it's sort of a multi-layered question. It's what are you entitled to financially? What are you entitled to with respect to your children? And these are not, when you're married, these are not questions that really come into play, right? When you're married, usually there's a joint pool of finances. There may be all good, maybe all bad. It could be all debt, but it's joint. And you're raising your children together. But suddenly now, at the time of divorce, you are now suddenly facing the reality, it's very true, that you're going to not only divide your finances, but you're going to now divide your time with your children in some fashion. So I can see why this showed up on the list. It is a very common question. And the first thing that I will say to you is, unfortunately, at the beginning of a divorce, you can't answer that question. You can't know exactly what you're going to end up with. And that's why the divorce process is, or one of the reasons why the divorce process can be so difficult, because as I've talked about in other videos, it's a time of limbo where you don't know what you're going to end up with, and you don't know what things are going to look like on the parenting side with your children. But there are some basics that you can get started with on the property or the financial side. So depending on the state that you live in, some states are community property states, like California, where I practice, and other states are what we call equitable distribution states, which is Connecticut, where I practice as well. So I practice in states that have both approaches to dividing the property between the parties. They both essentially come at it, though, first from a perspective of you need to quantify what the marital estate consists of. So in California, generally, anything that you had prior to marriage is separate property. Anything acquired during the marriage is community property or marital property. And anything that's acquired after separation, which is subject to another video, because that can be a question as to when did the parties separate. But after separation, that would go back to being separate property. There's a lot of nuance to that, which may not on its face seem apparent, but when you start practicing in California or in a community property state, you quickly learn that there's a lot of nuance to what is community and what is separate. But essentially, everything that's separate stays with the person who owns that property. Everything that's community property is divided 50-50, and it's right down the middle. So in a community property state, your community property, your marital estate is going to get divided 50-50. So the question isn't so much what are you going to get, it's what goes into the marital pie that you're going to get 50% of. In an equitable distribution state, it is divided in a fashion that is considered fair and equitable under the circumstances of your case. I think you can see that that's a little generally broader or more nebulous or more open to interpretation. What is fair and equitable in every case? I can pretty much guarantee what you think is fair may not be what your spouse thinks is fair, and what both of you think is fair might not be what a judge thinks is fair. But you start in the same place. You start with, well, what are we dividing up? And that is in any divorce, that's the first part. So you have to quantify, what is the house worth? What are the cars worth? What are the bank accounts? What about the retirement accounts? What about the debt? So it's not all just the good, it's the bad too. And it all gets quantified and then determined whether it's a part of the marital estate or if those things belong separately to one of the parties. And then you talk about what's fair. Now, I will say, after 30 years of practicing in an equitable distribution state, very often with respect to the marital estate, even in an equitable distribution state, you will see a relatively equal or 50-50 type of division in the end. So with both of them, I want you to keep in mind, however, that it's not usually a simple matter of taking every single asset that is joint, that's considered part of the marital estate, and cutting it in half, because that's not usually practical, right? So you have a house, you're not going to slice it down the middle, so you can't do that in most cases. So the only way for both of you to get your equity out of the property is to sell it usually. And that's not usually practical, or sometimes isn't practical. It's maybe not practical to go and divide out every investment account or every asset. Really, you'd have to almost liquidate everything and hand each of you a check to get that equal 50%. So once you've decided what the marital estate consists of, the question is really how you're going to divide that up so that you both end up with equal shares, but perhaps by moving the puzzle pieces around, one of you gets all of one asset and another one gets other assets to equal that value. So you do a balancing thing. And that becomes a large part of the negotiation. In fact, that's the greatest part of the negotiation. Now, that's on the property side of things. So you can, you're going to end up with a roughly equal, or unless there's circumstances out of the ordinary, roughly equal division of the marital estate. On the side of your children, you're going to end up with a parenting plan that is in the best interests of your children. That is the standard in every state. It's not what you want. I hear for all the time from parents, well, I want more time with my kids. I want my kids to be with me on weekends. I want this, I want that. That is not a defining factor in a parenting plan. What a parenting plan is based on, especially if you're in front of a judge, but really for parents, it should be based upon what is in your children's best interests. And again, just like with finances, I can almost guarantee that you and your ex-spouse are not going to 100% agree on what's in your children's best interests. But hopefully you can sit down at a table and come to a general understanding and work something out, because honestly, what is in your children's best interests is that the two of you do work it out, and that you don't leave it to some stranger in a robe to tell you how you're going to co-parent. And then the final thing that I think people always want to know is, what am I going to end up with? Am I going to have to pay alimony? Am I going to get alimony? And that's a separate question that is probably one of the more difficult questions to answer in any divorce. I'll be doing another video on that in the next couple of days, so keep a lookout for it. But generally, alimony is awarded in cases where you have disparate incomes. Each state has statutory criteria that a court would take into consideration, and it's usually awarded for, if it's appropriate, it's usually awarded for a certain period of time in a certain amount. And there's a lot of permutations. I will go over that in the next video. But I did want to just touch on that, alimony is, or spousal support, if you're in a state that calls it that, is another issue and something that people are really interested in. So what am I entitled to in my divorce? You're entitled to, in most cases, what is fair, if you're in an equitable distribution state, which is subject to interpretation. And you're entitled to 50% of the marital estate if you are in a community property state. Both of those rely upon, first, a quantification as to what the marital estate is, and that's where the complexity lies. So stay tuned for the alimony component of this discussion. And I hope you found this helpful. If you'd like more tips and resources, please visit my website, divorceinaBetterWay.com. And I'll see you soon.